All right, let's talk about proton pump inhibitors, or PPIs. If you're a clinician, you know these drugs inside and out. You probably prescribe them all the time. I mean, they're a total mainstay for acid-related disorders. But their incredible effectiveness has actually created a really complex situation, one we really need to dig into.
So why are they so common? Well, check this out. A whopping 20% of the US population suffers from GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease. Think about that. That's literally 1 in every 5 people dealing with stuff like heartburn and regurgitation. This huge number is exactly why PPIs became the blockbuster drugs we know today.
So here's the plan. We're going to follow the story of PPIs. First, how they became the go-to solution. Then we'll ask, are they maybe too common? After that, we'll get into the long-term risks. And finally, we'll cover the really crucial skill of deprescribing.
First things first, let's just take a moment to appreciate what made these drugs such a revolution. Seriously, before PPIs came along, managing severe acid disease was a whole different ballgame. They absolutely changed everything.
So what are we talking about here? PPIs are a class of drugs that just slam the brakes on stomach acid production, and they do it in a big, long-lasting way. This isn't like an antacid that just mops up the acid that's already there. Nope, PPIs go right to the source and shut down the factory.
And the way they do it is just clinically elegant. You see, PPIs build up in the acidic canals of the parietal cells. Once they're there, they get activated and form this unbreakable covalent bond with the proton pump itself. That's the H+K+ ATPase enzyme. They basically lock onto it and throw away the key.
So, to put it simply, they just turn off the acid pump, physically, permanently. And that powerful mechanism of action is exactly why they're so much more effective and last so much longer than older options like H2 blockers.
Okay, so they're incredibly successful. But that success has kind of led to a whole new problem, right? Have we started to lean on this amazing tool a little too much? Let's actually look at the scale of how much they're being used.
I mean, look at this. The entire market is dominated by just a handful of molecules. You know the big names: esomeprazole, omeprazole. We're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry, which just goes to show you how deeply baked these drugs are into our prescribing habits all over the world.
And this is where things start to get a little concerning. This statistic is pretty startling, isn't it? A huge majority of PPI prescriptions, especially in a hospital setting, might not even have a clear, evidence-based reason for being started, or they're just continued for way too long.
So here's the disconnect. Yes, some conditions like severe erosive esophagitis absolutely require long-term use. But the data shows that only about 30% of patients on chronic therapy actually fit the guideline criteria. That means the other 70% are likely taking a medication they just don't need anymore. And that brings us right to the next big question: what are the consequences of all that unnecessary long-term use? Over the last decade or so, we've seen this growing mountain of observational data that's raising some pretty important safety signals.
The list of potential issues is, well, it's not short. When we change the stomach's pH for a long time, we might be setting off a chain reaction. We're talking about everything from poor absorption of key nutrients like B12 and magnesium to making the gut a friendlier place for nasty infections like C. diff. And on top of that, there are growing concerns about bone fractures and even chronic kidney disease.
Let's just zero in on fractures for a second. You can see a really clear trend here. The adjusted odds ratio for a hip fracture goes up the longer a patient is on therapy. Now, for any single patient, the absolute risk is pretty small. But when you apply this to millions of people, that adds up to a lot of preventable fractures.
Now, this comparison is key. A big meta-analysis found that while PPIs were linked to about a 30% increased risk of hip fracture, the same wasn't true for H2 receptor antagonists. What does that tell us? It suggests the risk might be specific to how PPIs work, not just a result of suppressing acid in general. It's a really important distinction.
So, given how widespread they are and these potential long-term risks, a whole new clinical skill is coming to the forefront: the art of deprescribing. And I call it an art because it's not just about stopping a pill. It's a careful, patient-centered process. I mean, anyone who has tried to take a patient off a long-term PPI knows it is not always a walk in the park. So what's going on? Why do symptoms seem to come back with a vengeance? The answer is pure physiology. It's called rebound acid hypersecretion. See, when you suppress acid for a long time, the body responds by jacking up gastrin levels, which basically builds up the acid-making machinery in the stomach. So when you suddenly take the PPI away, those supercharged cells can unleash a tidal wave of acid, often making symptoms feel even worse than before.
And this quote from a patient forum just captures that feeling perfectly. People want to stop. They know it's probably a good idea, but they are absolutely terrified of that rebound, and that fear creates a huge hurdle for us.
So the best way forward is with a clear strategy. First, just stop and reassess. Does this patient still need this PPI? If the answer is no, then start a slow taper. You can reduce the dose or try switching to every other day. The end goal is to get them to on-demand use. And this is critical. You have to give them a bridge, H2 blockers, antacids, something to manage those rebound symptoms that you know are coming.
And let's never, ever underestimate our own role here. The conversation we have with our patients is a powerful tool in itself. When we actually partner with them and frame this whole thing as a positive goal that we're going to get them off a medication, it becomes incredibly motivating. That partnership is often the secret to success.
Which leaves us with this final question to think about in our own daily practice. With all their power to control symptoms, PPIs carry this real risk of creating a physiological dependency. So, are we using these amazing drugs to heal and then step back? Or are we, without meaning to, creating a long-term dependency? The real value we bring as clinicians is knowing how to navigate that very, very fine line.